Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello. Welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know that Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, recruited the Creek tribe in Alabama, present-day Alabama and Georgia, to join their resistance to Western white settlement? And that the U.S. almost went to war with Spain during the War of 1812? And finally, did you know that Andrew Jackson forced the Creek and Cherokee to forfeit over 21 million acres of land to the U.S. government at the Treaty of Fort Jackson? Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 105, the War of 1812, the War in the South. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 105. I am excited to cover the war in the South today, sort of our third theater of war that we're covering in the War of 1812, and I have my fellow history nerd and good buddy, Zach Woods, joining me again on this episode. Welcome back, Zach.
Thank you, Chris. Always a pleasure to be back, and also glad to have a webcam this time.
Yes, very much. You're on the webcam, and so hopefully we'll have some more synergy in our conversation. It'll be a bit more natural since I'll be able to look at you when you want to interrupt me and I'll know when it's coming.
Yeah, instead of me just being like, ooh.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. We'll see.
That's
how
still going to happen.
Yeah, probably. So I really, Zach, I just want to jump right into it. So, my previous episodes were D.C. and Chesapeake campaign, and then we talked about Baltimore, and now we're transitioning down to the war in the South. And, the war in the South was really unique because it involved so many different languages and cultures. A bit different than the war in the Northwest and the war in the Chesapeake area. And what we're really going to do in this episode is focus on two different pieces of it, I guess, the Creek War, and then begin to introduce the fighting in the Gulf Coast. And that's something that we're going to be covering more on a future episode with the Battle of New Orleans and Jackson's great victories down there that really wrapped up the war, along with the Treaty of Ghent. And I know, Zach, that you were saying before we went live that you saw symmetry in this part of the conflict that you wanted to touch on.
Yes. So basically, if you think of the United States in your mind at this moment, you have basically the American states on the East Coast, and then between the Mississippi River and the American states, there's the Appalachian Mountains. And other than Kentucky and Tennessee, basically the rest of the area is Indian territory. And this Indian territories are it is populated by lots of different peoples. So in the north, you had Wyandot, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and in the south, it was we would refer to it as the Creek Confederacy, which was a variety of different native groups, basically in the central Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi region. And that both of these confederacies, the Shawnee in the north and the Creek in the south, basically opposed American expansion. And this is going to be one of the last periods in U.S. history where there's a large confederacy with foreign support, the British in the north and the Spanish tokenly in the south, sort of in the south, not as much as what we discussed with the north and how the Shawnee Confederacy had had strong support from the British. But this is going to be the last period in U.S. history where there's strong resistance from native confederacies with European support against American encroachment. And the results in both of them are going to ultimately be that the native confederacies are defeated and the United States will gain more territory. And it's going to set up basically the American West and American Southeast for the next 30, 40 years of what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in this conflict, it was viewed as many. Some historians even view this as just like a Creek Civil War, and they almost separate it totally from the War of 1812 narrative, but I think it makes a lot of sense to include it for a variety of reasons that we'll get into in this episode, and hopefully will become abundantly clear by the time we're done with this episode. Or I should say finished. I always get in trouble with my wife when I say the word done instead of finished. She said,
that's because she's a real writer.
Yeah, she said, dinner in the oven is done. You are finished. I'm like, okay, thank you. So it really, this was a civil war within the Creek Confederation. That's how it got involved. And then Spain, as you mentioned, they were tokenly and nominally involved in the South, but they were still there, even though they didn't have much of a presence in the South.
Yeah, we should mention, and I kind of didn't say this explicitly, that Spain they own the possession of Florida, which is primarily St. Augustine and Pensacola. Mm-hmm. Miami doesn't exist yet, people. There's
yes. Yeah. There's
no
Miami
Cuba
yet.
Libres on Miami Beach yet.
So, what really happens here is you see this continued western expansion of white settlement. Spain allies with the Creek Confederation to keep that at bay as much as they can. And U.S. eventually allies itself with the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and some of the Creek, because at this time the Creek were split between the Upper Creek and the Upper Creeks and the Lower Creeks. Like Zach mentioned, in areas present-day Alabama, Georgia, and a little bit of the Florida Panhandle too. But the U.S. traded with the Lower Creeks, so they had a relationship, right? They had an economic alliance with the Lower Creeks, and because of that, over time, American culture began to, wear off on the Lower Creeks a bit, or the Lower Creeks began to openly assimilate some American culture into their culture, which made them considerably different than many of the Upper Creeks and other natives of the Creek Confederation. Over the years since the Revolution, at this time, the U.S. has signed treaty after treaty with the Creeks, and the subsequent treaties just saw the United States of America expanding further and further west into their territory, accessing the port of New Orleans, which of course was later included in the Louisiana Purchase. In the lead up to the War of 1812, there was quite a bit of fighting in this region. Britain and Spain both did not recognize the Louisiana Purchase for whatever that's worth. And there was clearly territorial tension between the United States of America, Spain, and the Creek Confederation during this time as the War of 1812 is on the horizon. In 1812, there's something known as the Patriot War, and this is when U.S. forces captured areas of East Florida. They were threatening the Spanish hold on present-day Florida. It wasn't too much of a significant threat, but it was enough to become concerned about, and it sort of continues to overlay into the upcoming broader conflict, the War of 1812. Spain responded as best they could by offering support of the Creeks in their attempt to once again push this white settlement back, and these quote-unquote patriots back east and back further north. And the Spanish needed really to ally with the Creek because, as Zach mentioned, they were really weak in this area. They could not fight on their own. They didn't have the manpower or the money, the presence they weren't able to do it. And so they needed to ally with the Creek.
Yeah, basically, Spanish colonial policy was to have a buffer between them and what they view as an expansionist America. So a great way to have a buffer is to support and supply native peoples in between the two states. And so basically by supporting members of the Creek Confederacy, arming them, basically encouraging a trade relationship and providing arms and munitions, you would create that buffer. Well, the problem when you create that buffer is if you have a very aggressive commander like one Andrew Jackson, he might view you arming, if you're the Spanish, arming these native peoples as a belligerent act, and then he might respond by invading Spanish Florida.
Yeah. Well, Zach, those are a lot of hypotheticals that sound very familiar.
They're hypotheticals, right? Sometimes hypotheticals become, actual theticals. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like if General Andrew Jackson sees a buffer, he might just blow right through it.
Yeah. He had a certain tenacity that you can see as a virtue.
Yeah, sure, and we'll talk more about him.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about him.
He's gonna loom very large. I'm actually really not looking forward to having to reread a bunch of Andrew Jackson biographies, but whatever.
Yeah, that's okay. You can pretend to like it.
I will eat my medicine,
That's what I do
sir.
with some things. Yeah, there you go. So that's a great point, right? These Native Americans acted as a buffer between the United States and Spain. Years prior to the war, American agents had, like I mentioned, increased trade with some of the Creeks and forced some assimilation in these areas. The problem that many Lower Creek in Georgia had was that they were becoming, and this is such a common theme in American and Native American relationships, the Native Americans become more and more reliant on American trade. So over time, what happens is the standard of living changes, the expectation changes when it comes to certain food, alcohol, clothing. Native Americans become reliant on that, and the white settlers who are trading with them, or the Americans who are trading with them, gain leverage over them, enforcing at times some type of assimilation on them. And we saw this a bit with the relationship between the Americans and the Creeks. In 1811, this conflict directly wraps into the larger narrative of the War of 1812, when Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet traveled to Tukabachi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, to speak with the Creek. Tecumseh spoke to an audience of about 5,000 Creek for about an hour. And he told them all about this idea of resisting American encroachment. He talked to them about what he and his brother were doing further up north and the success that they could have if they all resisted, simultaneously against this westward expansion of the American white settlers. And he wanted them to join Tecumseh and Tezcuatahua, the prophet, in their resistance movement. The war party that began to emerge out of this resistance movement within the Creek Confederation were known as the Red Sticks. And this name came from the red sticks that they had that would symbolize war. Immediately, the Creeks who did not support the war became targets of the Red Sticks, viewed as traitors to their people. And many of them were massacred, and brutally massacred at that. Fighting really broke out in July 1813 when American forces became involved following a few different Creek attacks on American soldiers and civilians. In August of 1813, you have the Fort Mims Massacre, where over 400 people were killed, including women, children, and many white settlers. And once the Fort Mims Massacre got involved, and this phrase I'll probably repeat many times over, especially as we head into the Civil War and or the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. After the Fort Mims Massacre, American blood was spilled on American soil. And all of a sudden, some Americans got really, really indignant and worked up about it. And that's what happened here. The American militia got far more involved following the Fort Mims Massacre of August 1813. With more attacks throughout the region, Americans demanded the government get even more involved to protect them from the ensuing massacre of the natives, or from the natives, I should say. Included in this recruitment was a man named Colonel Andrew Jackson. The Tennessee legislature raised 5,000 men, 2,500 of them fighting under Andrew Jackson, who was charged with instructions to, quote, repel an approaching invasion and to afford aid and relief to Mississippi Territory. Soon, the Lower Creeks and Cherokee joined in the offensive with the Tennessee and Georgia militia. By October 1813, Mississippi militia joined with a force of about 1,000 men. Over the next 6 months, militia from North Carolina and South Carolina also joined in the fighting. But our main focus in this conversation will really be on the Tennessee militia and one Mr. Andrew Jackson. And the Tennessee campaign of the Creek War in 1814 really had two primary objectives. Number one, defeat the Creek. And not just defeat them in battle, but totally defeat them as much as they could, right? Rip the spirit out of the Creek people. Take the land and know that they have been utterly defeated. Step two, objective two, was to take Pensacola, stick it to the Spanish, and begin to march on Florida. And that's really exactly what Andrew Jackson was able to accomplish. This began in October 1813, and Jackson scored some significant victories early in his campaign. But over time and into the winter, things got really rough. There were poor supplies, short enlistments, and Andrew Jackson saw his total number of men by January 1814 down to about 100. That's right, 100 total men. In February of 1814, though, he found some relief. The 39th U.S. Infantry arrived, and his force swelled to almost 5,000 men. At the end of March 27th, 1814, Jackson and his 3,000 men, along with about 600 Native American allies, fought the Creek at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson's first significant victory in war.
And a great place to go climbing, which I have been to.
That's great. Thank you, Zach, for that.
I'm just adding a little color.
Riveting analysis.
No, it is actually a pretty cool place to go. If you actually live in the Alabama or Georgia region, you should go there. It's a pretty cool area.
Yeah, I've never been there. I'll have to check it out. But this was really Jackson's first huge victory as a military officer. There were only 49 Americans killed, 154 wounded, out of about 2,000 men. Meanwhile, there were about 1,000 Creek fighters, and he killed 800 of them. Not he personally, but he and his men. That would be some kind of record. This brought the Red Stick resistance to an end for all intents and purposes. And that brings us to the short-term and long-term results of this conflict. In August 9th, 1814, the Treaty of Fort Jackson really ended it. It saw the Creek cede over 21 million acres of land, which is about half of the entire state of present-day Alabama and part of southern Georgia. And they ceded all of this land to the U.S. government. To make matters even worse, for the Creek, this war, it could be argued, was a civil war between two Creek peoples. But the American settlers forced their way in, and then Jackson swooped in, and after victory, didn't distinguish between the Creek that allied with him and those that fought against him. He treated them all the same. They were all the same to him after the conflict, which is why what ends up happening is there were many Creek that allied with the Lower Creek, which I mentioned, which allied with the Americans and allied with Jackson, and they actually lost significant portions of their land too, because Jackson didn't really care.
And this is also a trend that is going to happen again and again in U.S. history, is that Native peoples who ally with the United States will find themselves betrayed and losing their land.
Yes, and a lot of it comes down to, I'm sure, genuine miscommunication, and a lot of it, or I should say most of it, is not miscommunication.
Okay, yeah.
And was done very purposefully. Yeah, I'm just trying to leave room for the times there was genuine miscommunication. Right,
yes.
I don't like to speak in absolutes. A side note, also. Jackson and the Americans took almost 2 million acres from the Cherokee Nation, too, which, by the way, served as allies to the Americans during this war. But once again, to Jackson, Native Americans are Native Americans. And if they had land that he wanted, he was going to do what he could to take it. Jackson then continued into Florida, eventually driving the British out of Pensacola and defeating them at the Battle of New Orleans, something we will talk about next episode in much more detail. A few years later, just sort of projecting forward here so you guys know as we keep up with the Jackson narrative, a few years later he'll invade Florida again, this time in the First Seminole War, chasing some of the Creek that he believed had escaped his grasp during the conflict in 1814. And after this, Jackson really becomes a national figure in the U.S. His victory at Horseshoe Bend, New Orleans, and the First Seminole War helped to catapult him into the spotlight, which would eventually lead to him becoming the 7th president and ushering in the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, all things that we'll get into in much more detail. And Zach, I know that you wanted to have a bit of a conversation about like the broader picture here, with the Creek conflict and the fighting in the South in the War of 1812, and how we can help sort of tie this all together to the broader American narrative.
Well, Chris, before I get into that, let's talk about Florida really quickly.
Okay, so that makes sense.
So Jackson and his victory over the Creek Confederacy is a big deal in the South, the southeast of the United States. However, Jackson is not the kind of guy to stop with just defeating his enemy in front of him. He views very much as that the Red Sticks are an extension of Spanish imperial power, colonial power, and wants to basically attack Spain. Specifically in Pensacola, which he views as the source of potential future. Yes, he's defeated the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, but he wants to permanently defeat them. And as long as there's Spaniards willing to potentially arm them, they are still a threat. So he actually sends a very famous belligerent message to Spain. And I have a quote from it here. Quote, refugee bandita from the Creek Nation are crowding into Florida, drawing rations from Spain's government, and under the drill of a British officer. The United States will retaliate if provoked, and he cites his creed saying, quote, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, scalp for a scalp. So this is like a very belligerent threat, directly to the Spanish authorities in Florida. And what's particularly ballsy about it is the Secretary of War / State, James Monroe, specifically had ordered Jackson not to attack Florida. And Jackson just pretends to not receive the letter and basically attacks Florida. There were British ships at Pensacola. There was British officers there. It is a very short campaign. There isn't much of a fight, but he captures Pensacola, which could have been this big international incident, brought Spain onto the side of the war with Great Britain. Spain and Great Britain are engaged in the Napoleonic Wars and are allies. So, this has the real potential to be a big problem. And similar to another American general who kind of got in over his head with foreign powers, one George Washington. Folks remember back at the start of the 7 Years' War in Fort Necessity. But in this case, it ends up being okay, in part because this is the capture of Pensacola is the immediate setup for our next episode, the Battle of New Orleans, which is the British will be sending a fleet to capture New Orleans. Their big offensive for the Southern War, in part because of what's happened in Pensacola. And Jackson will quickly use his irregular forces and his regular forces and rush from Pensacola to New Orleans to defend there.
I'd also like to point out that like Jackson's total ignoring of I love how you said that, Secretary of War / Secretary of State
for the first time ever, right?
James
the first and only time ever that happened.
First and only time ever. Yeah, I mentioned that last episode. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. And that will, as we will see in this podcast, will become a trend of Jackson's to just conveniently ignore orders that are not favorable to him. And of course, we'll have more.
So there's a lot of
examples of that.
Part of why we're stopping and to talk about this is a lot of the things that are going to happen in the next 20 years. There's strong foreshadowing here about, to your point, Jackson not necessarily obeying the normal sources of authority, being hyper aggressive towards native peoples, the general expansion of the United States. that's going to follow the War of 1812 to the Mississippi River and starting to go beyond the Mississippi River. And so those are the basic trends. So to take a step back even further, so when we started this podcast, we talked a lot about the Native story has been coming into the American story quite often. They are allies. They are sources of resistance, of exchange. They're part of us as white Anglo-speaking Americans, part of our national mythos. But this is really the point that I feel that the potential for Native peoples to have formed a confederacy as a blocking force to American expansion is finally defeated. Spain and Great Britain or other European powers in North America will not support Native confederacies in the opposition of American expansion. And without European support, there's just no hope. And that's in part for a variety of reasons. Some of which is just disease, some of which is what you mentioned is the dependence on European goods, and then those European traders not always being good actors. For instance, the spreading of smallpox blankets or trading of rum and other things to, cheat natives out of land. And we've talked about that trend, but which will continue. But as a force of opposition or an extension of European powers in North America, this is the death bell of that. And it's going to set up the next coming 20 years of Indian removal and the Indian Wars up the Midwest into the Southeast to basically push Native peoples into Indian territory, which is essentially the modern state of Oklahoma. So this is, sorry to be kind of depressing, but it's important to know that this is kind of a depressing part of American history, which is going to be what certain people would refer to as genocide or ethnic cleansing. But basically, it is it's essentially the expulsion of the Native peoples, and there will be no European allies to support them in their resistance anymore.
Yeah, and if just going to continue, and like you mentioned, we'll talk about more and more examples of this as we move forward. So, Zach, what? Give me your thoughts on the state of the war at this point.
Well, the U.S., it's kind of been a mixed bag, right? We talked about how they had this opportunity where they could have, captured Canada, expand the territory. They kind of fell flat on their face. They rebound and kind of recover. But then with Great Britain basically defeating Napoleon in Europe, or their allies and them defeating Napoleon in Europe, to be more accurate, deploys larger forces to the Americas. Washington is burned. Baltimore is attacked. Ultimately, it's defended. But right, you're kind of at this moment of impasse. Canada has been protected. American borders in the north have been defended. There has been success from the American perspective in the south. The Creek Confederacy has been broken. They're in a position of power. But this is the setup for the big offensive that is supposed to come from the British. They've burned Washington, D.C. Yeah, the attack on Baltimore didn't really work out very well, but we still have a lot of ships.
No, it didn't. Yeah. Nope. Nope, take that.
Yeah. We still have a lot of ships. We still have a lot of men. What's the next logical target? And the next logical target, they believe, is New Orleans, in part because of Jackson's attack on Pensacola. That they believe that New Orleans is a soft, easy target that they can take and again demonstrate Britain basically had kind of learned something from the American Revolution, which is, hey, we shouldn't march into the country and try to hold all the little towns. Let's just demonstrate our naval power and superiority and just seize the important ports and show hey, you guys don't have a navy, you can't do anything. Try to force the United States to sue for peace and maybe give up possessions by, capturing our cities from time to time.
Yeah. And what now, and we know that, or if you may not know this if you're listening to the podcast right now, but you will soon enough, that Jackson won a resounding victory at New Orleans due in very large part to some horrible decision making on the part of the British, which was just still baffling to me as I learned more and more about it. What would the British plan have been if they had been able to win at New Orleans?
I mean, we can talk about this more next episode, but basically, right, it's you seize the territory, and by seizing the territory, you're able to dictate some terms,
Yeah.
Given that the United States didn't sue for peace after the capture and burning of D.C., you didn't take Baltimore, it's always going to be a negotiated end of the war, right? Great Britain isn't going to try to reconquer the colonies, even though I'm sure there were some in Britain who would have liked that to have happened. But basically, right, you're trying to basically strengthen your hand to go in negotiations, and Monroe and Madison both also realize this. To make it for a transition, this is something that a reader had asked us about, which is who wins could you say anyone really wins the War of 1812? No, but yes at the same time, which I think is something that makes the War of 1812 kind of interesting, is that both sides can claim victory, both sides can argue the other side lost, and because of that, it makes it a very interesting moment in history because of how we tell stories about it. And what becomes popularized in our mythos, right? The Star Spangled Banner is the defense of Fort McHenry, and it's not some poem or something about Saratoga or Yorktown. It's this battle, so it's going to be very important for our national identity. So.
Yeah, for sure, and you're right. We'll get more into that in the next couple episodes as we really wrap up 1812, the War of 1812. Next episode with the Battle of New Orleans, and then following it with the Hartford Convention and the Treaty of Ghent. So, Zach, anything else before we sign off and wrap up the Southern Theater and start to prep for our next episode on the Battle of New Orleans?
No, just that this is going to be the big coup de grace battle of the war that most people remember. And we tried to spend a little time talking about some other battles that are important for Canadian national identity. So don't forget those. Yeah. Or Ohio national identity.
Yes, absolutely. All right, Zach. Well, thanks for hopping on, and listeners, thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.